Welcome, everybody. This is the Annie in the Middle blog at winningwriters.com. Thank you so much for watching. I'm here today to talk about book structure and the North Street Book Prize with Jendi Reiter, editor of winningwriters.com and an award-winning novelist and poet. Their novel, Two Natures, won the Rainbow Award for Best Gay Contemporary Fiction and was a finalist for the Book Excellence Awards and the Lascaux Prize for Fiction. And of course, Jendi, along with co-judge Ellen LaFlèche, is one half of the final judging team for Winning Writers North Street Book Prize. So welcome, Jendi. Thank you so much for joining with me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's just jump in. My first question is about book structure, just to get right to the topic. Writers and editors often consider books structure and talk about the word structure, but to many authors, especially authors who might be at the beginning of their career, just starting out, the word structure can seem really vast. So what does structure mean to you?
Thanks, that's a great question. I think book structure to me is like if you think of the metaphor of a house, the book structure is the mood of the house, the style of the house, and also how you move through the rooms of the house. Where do you linger? What leads to what? And that's choices that you're making about what's connected and how important certain things are. Where is the center? Where is where the action is happening? And what does everything lead to? And that doesn't mean everything has to go quickly, but that you should be intentional about why someone is lingering in a certain passage and what it's going to take you to, so that you'll look back on that and say, oh, that was all building up to something and it paid off. Or maybe you just like to create a mood where people are sitting and enjoying and looking at details and experiencing the vibe. You know, a book can run on vibes. It doesn't have to run on action, but
Yeah.
you really have to have a lot of internal movement in that sense. You have to have a lot of attention to nuance of how feelings and emotions shift. So there's still drama, even if it's not drama you could televise. So that's kind of what structure means to me. It has to do with pacing. It's the framework in which the pacing happens.
Do you think there's such a thing as like a basic or a standard book structure? And if so, what would that be like?
Well, I mean, I can start genre by genre, you know, with a memoir, for example. It seems like we get a lot of memoirs that just go straight chronologically. You know, this is my childhood, this is my adulthood, and it takes a lot to make that retain interest. And what I often find is books like that fizzle out in adulthood because your everyday life is just not as intense as an adult. When people are children, I think the way that they experience the world, everything is new and everything is sensory detail is really interesting to them, and their perspective is fresh. And then if you're just continuing that blow by blow as an adult, it kind of fizzles out. So what I really like in a memoir, if it is going to be more straightforward chronological, is to have a shorter span of time. Um, you know, you might start with a dramatic incident and then lead up to how you got there. That's a pretty easy to follow structure. It's like I was at my father's funeral and I did not expect him to die at 42, and you know, and I look back at what led to that, and then you go back. You know, so you know what the payoff's going to be. Why are you investing in this person's life story? Um, that said, I think an effective memoir structure is often plays with that, is braided perhaps. You might have narrative. I love braided books. I wrote one myself. You know, you have narrative that is interspersed with letters or poems or flashbacks. Or, for example, in one of our memoirs, it was just letters that the woman had written to her deceased wife. Her Widow by Joan Alden was one of our memoir winners, and that was a structure that was still pretty easy to follow chronologically, but left out all the filler. You know, like a standard structure, similarly in fiction, would be, you know, the action takes place chronologically, and you have a single point of view character, first person or third person, and you follow that closely. Um, and you know that can be great if you keep that tight and the point of view is interesting. But there's so many other ways you can do it too. Poetry, I feel like people don't structure their collections, and they should. That is just, I feel like I'm getting a batch of poems from someone that maybe they're all good, but do they lead? Does one lead to the other? Poetry, I think, has to either have a narrative arc or a thematic weaving of, 2 or 3, 4 or 5, whatever themes and image sets that you're going to start with and develop, like a fugue, like a motif that is being developed and recurring and, intertwining with other motifs. And to me, that's a collection that's really been thought through.
What would you say about the books that we receive that are more visually based genres, like the children's picture book, the art book, and of course the graphic novel and memoir category? Would you have any insight about the structure of those kinds of books?
Sure. And I think with art book, that's another one where you get the poetry collection problem that you're going to get, right? Annie is the screener, so she sees even more of
Yeah.
these.
Yep.
And, and I get Ellen and I get the top 50 to 70, which are all have a lot to recommend them. But that's often where the books really stand or fall is, gosh, with art books, so many repetitive images or images that don't seem to be presented in any particular order. And they might be really good images, but it becomes boring to read a whole book of it where you don't really feel like it's building to anything. There,
Yeah.
there has to be a sense that this is a development. It isn't just a collection.
Yeah, I remember the second cut from the 2023 contest that was
Mhm.
in the deconstruction book style. And I really liked a lot of the pages, and but it had so many styles in it. And I
Mhm.
ended up giving them feedback that it would be really nice if the book had kind of focused in on one of the styles and developed that style,
Mhm.
um, and kind of had an arc with that style rather than kind of flashing around from one style to the next.
One of our winners that was really beautifully produced in art book was The Art of Simeon Shimin. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but it was an artist from the 30s and 40s. He was a Jewish, um, kind of like a socialist, realist type of painter. He had murals and such, and also Hollywood posters for some of those big blockbusters. Very talented person who didn't get as much recognition and time to do his art because of economic factors. But that was a really interesting book because it started with an essay by him and essays putting his work in context, including the illustrations. And then you'd get the catalog of his illustrations at the end, where you had some context. It wasn't just the catalog. So that was a book that was really thought out well.
How about the children's book category? What are some of the structural strengths of the children's book?
I think a children's book does really well when it doesn't try to do too much because we're talking about picture books. We've only had middle grade as a category for 1 year. So I'm sure later on I'll have more thoughts about middle grade structure. Right now, I guess my general thoughts on fictional structure, but make it shorter, is my thoughts on middle grade. With a picture book, sometimes people just try to put uh, too many twists into a 32-page book, or they make it much longer than a 32-page book, which for a picture book is, a risky choice. Um, so, focus on one issue, one problem that's age appropriate, and then have the narrative resolve that problem.
Yeah,
It's harder than it sounds.
it
I've
is.
never written a picture book. I'm too
Yeah.
long-winded.
We get so many entries in the picture book category where it's like, here's this character. And on page 3, they go to the dentist. On page 5, there's a fire
Mhm.
in their school and they all have to run
Mhm.
out. On page 6, they go to the
Mm.
aquarium. And I'm like, wow, this would be a
Mhm.
really great series. But I think it feels a bit
Mm.
cramped when all of these things are just in one book.
I've always wanted to put in a plug for one of my favorite picture books in our contest, which is My Pants.
Oh my God, that's
I
one of my
can't remember
favorite
the
entries.
author's name right now, but
It's
she was
Nicole
just it
Kerr,
was
I think. Nicole
Nicole.
Kerr.
Yes, it was
Yeah.
it was one of our first prize winners. So people can look that up on the website from about 2 years ago. And it's this great book about this little autistic girl with sensory issues and her special interest with pants. And that was such a great structure. It was a unifying theme because she went to several different situations in that book, but it was all unified by one, the fact that she took things literally when it was an idiom. And so then you had that sort of humor, like Amelia Bedelia, where, she was trying to understand it. And so that was a recurring motif. And then the other motif was her talking about the kind of pants she was going to wear, or the kind of pants that the person,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
doctor or the psychologist or the teacher who didn't understand her was wearing. And then it's
Mm,
resolved where they find people who do understand her and do find accommodations for her to let her be who she really is. So I love
mhm.
that book. And repetition is really your friend when it comes to structuring a picture book. You
Yeah.
have like the same scenario. Think of a fairy tale, where the prince will meet three witches at one in a row, or three helpful animals,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
repeat some formula and with a little twist each time. And if
Mhm.
you just stick to that, you may find that a lot of your structural problems are solved, because
Yeah.
once you've done that 3 times, your book is over.
Yeah. So, we were talking about the house metaphor of the book structure and leading people through this space and having different purposes in each of the rooms. And then we talked about kind of the basic or standard book structure. But what is it like when the house just gets too crazy? Like when there's just too many kinds of rooms and, you go from one room to another, you feel like you're in a totally different house. So, in more conventional terms, what are some of the pros and cons of potentially venturing outside the norm with book structure?
Mhm. Well, I think you really hit on one, which is that you lose the thread of what's going on. That there's no editing down of, do these possibilities all belong in the same book, the same story, which is something that is really the hardest for me when I'm trying to write something a little more unusual. My first novel, Two Natures, was really pretty much a straightforward first person narrative, and the sequel, that is really a standalone book, but it's about the same characters. Origin story is a lot more moving parts, and throughout writing that, I was like, does this all make sense? Like, does this all belong in the same book just because it belongs in my head? You know? And I think after a while, with a lot of practice, one can really lean into one's particular grab bag of weirdnesses, and realize that you're the unifying factor. And if you're obsessed with these things, somehow there's something they have in common, but you still have to find a way to sell that to the reader. And that a lot of that has to do with just not lingering too long on things that don't serve the main reveal of the plot. Just putting a little bit of that in there. So that's I would say the pros and cons is you can get really distracted by a lot of different things. Um, but I think the pros is that you're doing something where the structure has as much thought put into it as the content. And when those two serve each other in a really interesting way, then the book has that much more depth. And I wrote down a bunch of ones that I thought did an interesting job of that, and I mentioned
Hmm.
Her Widow. Another
Hmm.
one that I liked from 2017 was The Cricket Cries the Year Changes. It was one of our honorable mentions, and it's about different enslaved people on the same plantation. And it has this unifying metaphor of a quilt that one of the enslaved women makes out of the bits of clothes of other people who have died. And so that I thought was a very good structure, because quilts had so much significance as coded messages for people escaping on the Underground Railroad. And they were an art form of people who don't have access to high culture because of oppression. So you already got the feeling of that time period and the opportunities that people had or didn't have from that form of expressing themselves. It was true to the character, and it was a good way to tie together all of these different anecdotes. I like that, like give a novel and stories, but you're always returning to the framing device.
Yeah, like intentionality is really important because one of the key
Mm-hmm.
elements of immersivity for me as a reader is authorly authority. Like if I feel like this is a voice that knows what it's doing, I'm very willing to be like, all right, like just take me there, like let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
So like establishing patterns is one of those things that
Mm-hmm.
really helps to establish authorly authority. Maybe your book has a weird pattern of some kind.
Yeah.
And, like a jazz musician, you can make a completely contiguous and consistent work of art by just repeating that pattern, just choosing
Mm-hmm.
to repeat that pattern with slight variations.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the books in the first rounds of judging that we see, they don't particularly make use of the patterns and motifs that they turn up. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people even just wander from the premise. The book starts in one place and then it's kind of got this feeling of like, well, I had to tell you this story to tell you that one. where they kind of use it as a jumping off point for a different kind of story. And Tracy Koretsky, who is doing the poetry critique,
Great
she had
writer,
this
by the
really
way.
great concept of like throat clearing, where if
Yes.
you find that you're abandoning your premise, maybe that wasn't your premise, maybe you're just clearing your throat before you tell the real story. And if so, you can kind of chop that bit off and maybe save it for another day or another piece or something like that. It doesn't really need to be for the reader.
That's a great insight. Yes, maybe you started your story several chapters ahead of the real story, or your poem
Yeah,
several
yeah,
stanzas ahead of the real heart of the
yeah,
poem. Yes,
yeah,
Tracy is
yeah.
such a great critic. She's
Oh my
really
gosh, she's
her.
so great. Like, yeah, I really
For
like
more
love
Tracy,
reading
look
her
at the
critiques.
critiques, the poetry critiques archive on our website. You can really learn a
Yeah.
lot from that.
Yeah. And then another
That's true.
insight that somebody told me, apparently a great author said that at a certain point in your manuscript, it always cracks in half, and you have to decide
Mm.
which half you want to go with. And I think a
Oh.
lot of the books we get to the North Street Book Prize, they still have the two halves kind of together.
Mhm.
And I think like, people at the beginning of their careers may not realize how extensive editing really is. And it could mean half of your manuscript is just gone.
Mhm.
And then you kind of
Or
take the
saved for
other
another
half and
project.
nurture it. Exactly, exactly. Of course, of course.
Yes.
I hate Murder Your Darlings. I'm much more of a
No, no.
rehome your
Yes,
darlings
rehome
kind
your
of person.
darlings. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. I think that books that jump around of narrators or in time can be very interesting because they reflect how consciousness really works and how we might have multiple perspectives in our own mind, or there's never just the present going on. There's always ruminating about the future and the influence of the past and things that never happen and things that might happen. We're always running on multiple timelines unless we're a Zen master who can be totally present. The mind
Yeah.
is really working on a lot of different tracks at the same time and jumping around. But if you're going to write that, and I say this as somebody who really didn't like reading books like that from the high modernist stream of consciousness period in high school, if you're going to write that kind of stuff, it's really important to have signposts that keep the reader on track about who's the narrator now, what's the time period, is this a flashback? A book that I really liked from, I think it was our very first year. No, it was a couple years after. Was it our first year? It might have been our first year. Elizabeth Kirshner, Waking the Bones. That might have been before you came on
Ah,
board, Annie.
yes,
This was
yes.
a memoir from one of our very first contests, and it was a memoir about childhood trauma. And she really took advantage of innovative structure to depict, not just describe, what it was like having a consciousness that was really fragmented and how she put herself back together. And she was a poet, so her work had a lot of associative leaps and juxtapositions. But she had these chapter headings where you're like, okay, the year is this and the location is that. And so something that simple, you know what she's talking about. And then you can get a cover for air and say, okay, this is which pond I'm in. And you can immerse yourself in all of the ripples and all of the undersea creatures and not really have to worry about narrative logic, because you'll get back to that because of her wonderful voice
Yeah.
um, and the way that what the book's going to be about. From, I don't remember exactly how it begins now because it's been a while since I read it, but you get a sense of what the topic of the book is going to be, and that she's going to tell in an unconventional way. And it's just so beautiful that you want to go along for the ride a little bit.
Yeah. So let's talk about your structure and your
Yay.
brain and
Sure.
the house that you have built with your upcoming novel origin story that will be
Uh,
released on July 15th. Could you please describe the structure of the book and the process of evolution it went through to get to its current form?
Sure. Well, origin story is the story of a man who recovers his traumatic memories by writing a superhero comic book. It's a gay literary novel set in the 1990s. And so I use tarot cards to help with plotting and story structure, and just as a ritual to get me from ordinary consciousness into creative consciousness when I start my morning writing process, or whatever time of day I sit down to write, I pull cards usually, and I ask the questions. Sometimes the question might be, what is this character thinking, or what's at stake in the scene? And sometimes the question might be, why is the scene not working? Is it me, or is it the book? Am I triggered, or does the scene not work, or are the characters stuck and that's why I'm feeling stuck, and so I need to write about stuckness? So the cards will help me with that. And so that's where I'm going to begin with that structure story, because when I first started plotting this book, I drew a card for who's the narrator, because at that time, Peter, my narrator, really didn't want to work with me. He really didn't want to tell this story. He was too traumatized. He was too triggered. He didn't feel like having a book out about his worst experiences in his life. And so I thought also there's things that weren't going to happen that he might not be present for. In my first book, I was limited by what is Julian, the narrator, going to actually experience. But here, when I'm telling a story about intergenerational trauma and secrets, I had to include information that Peter doesn't yet know and has to discover. And I also want to deal with the fragmented nature of his personality and his consciousness as someone who's just beginning to experience flashbacks and doesn't even know that's what they are yet. So the card I ended up drawing was the Eight of Wands reversed. And the Eight of Wands in the traditional tarot is eight flowering sticks flying through the air, seemingly unsupported in parallel. And so I thought, oh, this book has multiple narrators. There's
Mm-hmm.
something about this book that he needs companionship somehow to write this book, or this
Mm-hmm.
book is about things that all go toward the same place, but they're broken up into segments. So I've always been a fan of archives horror and archive stories, from H.P. Lovecraft, for example. I know he's problematic, but who isn't? His horror stories are all about discovering secret documents or secret objects that are cursed, or frozen monsters in the Antarctic, that to me, it's a great metaphor for buried trauma or the secrets of the universe that you
Yeah.
have to excavate, that might drive you
Mm-hmm.
crazy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding the true nature of things as, as a scholar, as a nerd who feels that truth is in old books. I
Mm-hmm.
love books like that. And so Origin Story had to include documents, uh, fake documents, which includes theology book excerpts written by Peter's deceased grandfather, who's a rabbi. And Peter is living in his apartment while it's being prepared for sale. And that's like a container for his memories. It's kind of like a place where the past and the present are a little bit blurry. I don't know if you've ever read this book, Jack Finney, Time and Again, I think it was called.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was like a sort of like a fantasy novel about this man who goes to New York City and moves into an apartment and thinks that he can go back into the past by being in a building that was in the past and surrounding himself with things and documents that are in the past, and he actually does. And so it's like the
Wow.
thin places where you're in this person's apartment and you're in 1998 or 2024, but you're also in 1970 when you were a child in this apartment. And those thin places make the past and the present really porous. And so I
Yeah.
wanted to create that archival feeling by including letters that are in the grandfather's apartment and diary entries by Peter's mother. And then, to get Julian, Peter's boyfriend, in there, because he's the kind of person who takes over every project that he's ever in. He had to have some emails in there. He had to have a whole section that he narrated, because there were things going on in his life that affected his relationship, that Peter wouldn't necessarily be in those scenes, but they were pivotal to understanding why both of their childhood trauma was interfering with their love life and how they were going to resolve
Mm.
that.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that gives the book realism by creating a documentary world for him to live in, uh, and also mimics the nature of how you have to piece together memories of trauma from fragments that you did to detective work, because people are not going to come out and tell you, oh yes, I molested you, or oh yes, I
Yeah.
knew that person was molesting you. That would be pretty
Absolutely.
unusual.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what I like about it too is that like the investigative process is definitely there and the documents are there and the memories are increasingly there. But I think one of the deeper layers that really struck me too is that it's not just an investigative process. It's also like a horror story or like a monster story, because it's got that classic horror structure of, like, the person feels that something is wrong. They don't know what it is. Then they hear a slight tapping outside on the street and they rush to the window. They're like, oh my God, what's there? And they don't see anything. Then the tapping is downstairs in their living room and they're
Mhm.
like, oh no, it's getting closer. I just don't know
Yes.
what it is. And then the tapping is at their door of their bedroom and they're like, oh, I don't know what it is. And then, like, it's right behind you. And that is also that's also a lot like what happens in this book. Because
Yes.
Peter, the truth for Peter is not just something he's seeking actively. It's something that's kind of, it's
It's seeking
imposing
him.
itself on his life and kind of coming back to him in these very triggering moments that
Mhm.
he's very intrigued by. Like, there's this wonderful moment where he sees a baby being changed by two adults, and
Mhm.
he is so, like, he's gripped with fear, with this really primal reaction. And then a little bit later, he finds himself kind of going back to this moment in his mind. And there's this really wonderful, I can't remember the exact wording, but it's like he's kind of just reaching out to touch this like electric wire or something in his
Mhm.
mind. Um, so,
Wow.
that's something that it's a moment he didn't look for. It's a moment he didn't necessarily want. But once it's kind of been born in upon him, he finds himself, investigating and probing it. You know, and, in a classic horror story, you want to say, don't go in there. But with Peter, we say, oh, go for it. Like, find it,
Mhm.
find it and recover your sense of self and your truth.
Living in the truth always gives you access to so much more creative energy than not.
Yeah.
And recovery is sounds too much like a conclusion when it's really a
Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like trauma recovery is a lifelong process, and it's one that takes different forms the further you go along, but at different levels, hopefully higher levels, the more you go into that basement and, you know, either slay the monster or, at least get rid of the monster or make peace with the monster. I'm so thrilled that you think I've written a horror story because it's one of my favorite genres. And I never really thought of myself as being able to write genre fiction. I don't know why. I think I'm just more of a character and vibes person than a plot person.
Mm.
But writing this book and writing the comic book scripts, which are another documentary part of this book, is Peter's comic book scripts, where he's through this character of the poison cure, who's either killing or curing people through his sexual contact. Um, he's expressing the contamination that one feels as sexual abuse survivor without knowing why. So like his
Yeah.
metaphors are telling him the truth before he knows the truth literally. And
Yeah.
writing those scenes was so cool to just like write a comic book script that I was like, I can, next thing I'm going to do is write genre fiction. I'm working on a fantasy novel, which is very hard.
Wow.
so so I learned a lot from trying out different genres within this book was
Yeah.
really a lot of fun.
Going back to this question about potentially venturing outside the norm with book structure, like, your book does take, it has a lot of different types of rooms and the rooms are decorated in various ways, but like, you have these really strong motifs that come back again and again, and just the thematic underpinnings of the book are so strong. And this, this unified plot arc of like the investigation slash, like, haunting, for lack of a better word, of the
Mhm.
past coming back. It all kind of blends together to keep it feeling very, very focused, despite these many tools that you're using. So, I just want to commend and appreciate, in front of Zoom and in front of the world.
Oh, thank you. It's such an
It's such
honor
a
to feel
well-formed
like
book. Oh my God.
it's
Um,
such an honor to be read and talked to by somebody who really, um, gets what I'm trying to do and also sort of teaches me new things about what I actually did, which is the fun thing about writing. It's like, oh,
yeah.
it's also that kind of book. I
Yeah,
will
yeah, yeah.
give a big shout out to my developmental editor because um, Dan Michelle Norris, who's the editor of Electric Lit right now, and too busy to return anybody's emails. So unfortunately, I don't think she's doing any new developmental edits because this was before she got that job. But like she was a former Winning Writers Contest judge, and she's also at the time a Black genderqueer person, now a Black trans woman. And so there's a supporting character in origin story who's a teenage Black bi-gendered person who like goes back and forth between a male and female persona. And so I wanted a sensitivity read on that, and Dad ended up just like giving me this whole developmental edit on it and made it so much of a stronger book.
Wow.
So I will say that even I've written a lot of books, did not do this on my own, and that it's really helpful if you're doing something that's unusual with a lot of moving parts to get a good developmental edit from someone like Annie or from another artist that you think knows stuff about not just how to write but know how to talk about books.
Yeah.
Someone who's a good critic, and get them to take a look at your book and see if they understand what you're doing and identify, not to like tell you what to do, but ask you, why are you doing that? And what if you did this? That's what I loved about how Den edited, because she really got what I was trying to do. And then she would say, I really liked this, and I feel like it gets a little baggy here. And, this section needs more polish, and it's not as focused. What if you
Yeah.
enhance this part and like left out that part?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and also just to kind of talk about Ty for a second, I really, really like this character because it is a supporting character and like they have their own life, they have their own psychology, they have their own arc, they have their own values, they have their own struggle. But at the same time, it's such a good supporting arc for Peter. And also, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but what we learn at the end completely casts what happens to Ty in like another light. Um, and makes it even more shocking. And it's a great social commentary about like oppression and people trying to keep others from being their true selves. Because there's even, that's sinister. That's, of course, very, very sinister. But what you learn at the end of the book makes it even more sinister and
Mm.
predatory than before. And I hope I'm not I don't think I'm giving too much away with
No,
that.
I
But
think that
um,
is just the right amount. We don't want anyone to know who the perpetrator or perpetrators are before they
no.
read the book.
But let's look at your beautiful cover. Could you please describe the story behind this cover? Because I think a lot of North Street entrants, maybe especially the people who or the books, that don't make it to the final rounds that you and Ellen look at. A lot of people are really, really struggling with their covers. So if you could just say something about what a really nice dynamic standout kind of cover is for a book today.
So this cover I chose. This artist is named Jim Shaw, who did the top one, and I believe he's an American artist. I saw his show at Mass MoCA, the art museum in Western Mass, about 10 years ago when I was just starting to think about origin story. And I thought, this is a visual representation of what my book is about. It's got comic books. It's got a guy who even looks kind of like Peter. It's got a parent overshadowing a child. It's got Genesis from the Bible, which is a theme throughout the book. Peter's grandfather had written a book about the sacrifice of Isaac, Abraham sacrificing his son, and he was writing an unfinished book about original sin. So here you have the snake. So I was like, this is my book cover. So I bought that book from the artist from the gift shop, and I had it in mind for almost 10 years, and I was able to get it licensed. And then my book is out from Saddle Road Press, and the publisher, Don Mitchell, is also a really great book designer, which is one of the reasons I love working with them. And so he decided, after many iterations of this cover that was more gray, black, and white, I wanted something that had a little more punch to it. And so we have this nice red here that really makes it distinctive and gives it kind of a little bit of that horror, thriller, drama, visual interest, but it's still artsy and literary too. And so here you have the original William Blake, God Creating Adam, that Jim Shaw's comic book version is based off of. So you have both the reference to help you understand this and the image of the split or the mirror world of the subconscious and the split personality and all of that stuff. So I just think Don did a brilliant job with that. And so I feel like cover design, where I look at the book entries, often a couple of mistakes that people make with cover design is the cover doesn't fit the mood of the book. The cover is hard to read. I've seen books that had no title or author name anywhere on the book, and I had to go into the database and look at compare the number on the sticky note that we put when we
Yeah.
process the book to the contact record to figure out what is this book called and who is it by. Don't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an extreme example, but um, something I would say about book design is that contemporary book covers, unless they're biographies or history books, rarely have actual photos on them anymore. If you're if you're using a stock photo on a book cover, it looks self-published in a way that isn't really to your advantage. It doesn't look professional and contemporary. Same for glossy book covers, which often don't last very long, get sort of curly and kind of crummy looking. A nice matte book cover with an illustration, if it's a good illustration, will usually do you better for a literary book. Uh, or a photo that's been treated somehow that's not just like a glossy color photo. Like some of the biographies, some of the memoirs have nice photo related covers, but they have a kind of a sepia tone, or they've been, I don't know, manipulated in some way where they look a little bit more soft focus.
Mm.
Uh, or they're inset with some other design elements. It isn't just a photo that bleeds to the edges of the page and then has type over it, because that doesn't give the contemporary high quality book design feel. It doesn't look like something you'd see in a bookstore. So
Mhm.
that's just the vibe. Um, Now, readability is another issue. You want your design elements not to clash with um, your text elements. Both of those should be easy to read. Uh, you want a font that expresses what the book is about. You don't want like a cheesy bleeding horror font if you're writing a romance novel, unless it's a horror romance. But even then, you
Yeah.
probably don't want that font because it's kind of
Yeah.
tacky.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a lot of things you can do, but I would just say, like, go into a store and look at the genre that you're writing in, and, like, be an art history student a little bit and think about what are some of the elements that the books in this genre have in common. And then, like, even go back and look at books that you've read from other decades, because you'll see there's styles decade by decade. Those 80s pulp horror novels look like Carrie,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you can so instantly identify when it was from, the type of book it is, or
Oh, yeah.
those doorstop kind of family sagas we all had on our parents' bookshelf
Oh,
in the
yeah.
70s,
Yeah.
with that sort of curly 70s font, and
Yeah.
the woman illustrated who's looking longingly at some man with the long hair. So it's like you get a vibe of the decade from
Yeah.
that. And maybe if you're writing a book about that decade, you're going to want that vibe. But you should
Yeah.
go and look at contemporary books in a bookstore to see what's the trend right now.
Mm.
Um, and it doesn't mean you have to follow it slavishly, but it does mean that you should have a sense of what's not being done. So you should have a good reason to change that if you're going to
Mhm.
change that.
Mhm. I want to tell people thinking about their own cover designs, dare to dream. Because with
Hmm.
your cover, there was a question at one point, right? Whether you would be able to license this image from the artist. So how did that go?
I went to the museum and I had that book and I just had it on my shelf all this time. When I finally was ready to publish this, I'd always kept that in mind as what I wanted for the cover. And so I Googled the guy and I found out, what where his agent was Gagosian Gallery. It represents a lot of artists. And I just emailed them and I said, I sent them the description of the book and told them my bio, so they knew I was a legitimate writer with other publications, and what the press was. And I said, we can only afford, I'm paying out of pocket because it's a small press. So I can
Yeah.
only afford, like three-figure number. And I said, would he be interested in licensing this? And it took a few months because he wanted to see a mock-up first to see if it would be represented well. And then he had a limit about what kind of aspect ratio, meaning like he didn't want if it was this way, he didn't want to suddenly be skinny or
Oh,
stretched out.
yeah.
Like he wanted it
Yeah.
to scale from whatever the original was, so it would really
Mhm.
represent what the artist did. And so the cover designer, we had to kind of work with that, which is why there's like this little black line here, because we couldn't stretch it out to be full bleed without
Mm.
messing with the aspect ratio. And then I just made him an offer. I said, would 300 be too low? And he's like, no, that's fine. Then like seven
Yeah.
emails later, I got the cover I wanted.
Amazing.
So
Yeah, so I
yeah, you
mean,
never
people
know.
out there listening, like if you have a really strong idea about the kind of image you want, like, you can go for it. Just
Hmm.
reach out. You never know.
It's nice to hopefully the artist knows that his art made an impression on me 10 years ago. And
Yeah,
that's probably a good feeling to know your work is fueling other work. And
absolutely.
another source of really great cover images, I might add, is check out your local or state level arts organization. Years ago, I got a grant from the Massachusetts Cultural Council for poetry, and they're a wonderful organization, and they have a database of hundreds of visual artists that they've given grants to. And so when I had a book cover I wanted done, I reached out to the contact person there. I said, hey, this is what my book is about. This is my poems. Like, this is the vibe I'm going for. Can you connect me with somebody who can do that? That's how I found this artist, because this book has some stories about Julian and Peter, the characters in my
Hmm.
novels, and Julian's a fashion photographer. So this artist creates these paintings where she
Mm.
tears up fashion magazines and makes a kind of a collage, and then she makes a painting image of the collage. So it's very painterly, but it also has the composition of these scraps from fashion magazines. And this guy looked so much like Julian that I had to have the
Wow.
cover. And again, it only cost me a couple $100. And the artist's name is Ariel Freiberg, Freiberg. And
Hmm.
I found her through the Mass Cultural Council, just by browsing some of their artists and asking the guy who was the contact person, who do you recommend for this style? Um,
Yeah.
so definitely try and support some of your lesser known visual artists in your area, and look at uh, local cultural council websites and browse their databases, because you
Yeah.
might find sculptures whose photographs you can use. You might find paintings or photographs, and you'll get something that's much more personal than a stock
Hmm.
photo, and probably
Yeah.
won't have to pay a whole lot for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
And
that you
what?
should
I
stiff your
also
local
like,
artists, but
no. I also want to bring up at this point, I think what a lot of people are really, really looking for when they send a book to a competition like North Street is simply somebody to look at the book and give some feedback. And so, plug for the North Street Book Prize. This year, we are
Mhm,
offering guaranteed feedback on all digital entries through Submittable, 5 to 10 sentences of the high, the strengths and the weaknesses of the book as I read it, because I'm the
yes.
one who's writing these things. But yeah, so we
You
are
know what you're
providing
doing.
that feedback this year, but also by working with an artist on your cover, especially someone who is local within your community, you will get the chance to have somebody interpret your work in a really
Mhm,
deep and profound way. And
mhm.
beta readers are great. People, your friends and family, maybe other writers, this is real, this is good, this is satisfying, but they're going to respond to it in words, basically. But
Mhm.
when you have an artist interpreting your words, it's such an amazing and special feeling, because you're seeing somebody else being inspired by what you're writing. But let's get back
Yeah.
to the North Street Book Prize.
Mhm.
So with Alan LaFleche, you are the top judge of the North Street Book Prize. And I'm wondering whether reading the North Street books has influenced the structure of your books.
That's a great question. I think that it's very hard sometimes to switch between writing hat and judging hat, because I love all of your books. I love being a book reader for a living. And I get so incredibly overwhelmed in November through January trying to do justice to this many books in a short period of time, that it's hard not to imagine some really overworked person reading my book and trying to find a reason not to give it a prize
Oh,
also. Um,
yeah.
so so it is difficult sometimes to turn off judging mind and let myself write those messy first drafts, and not really project what the reader is going to be, because no book is for everybody, and a book that Annie loves and sends on to me, I might not like, or
This
a book
happens, yeah.
that Annie gave only a second cut to, I might be like, hey, I want to see more entries in this genre. And like, I love this one, So even within our own business, we have very similar beliefs and tastes, but there's still so much subjectivity. So it's good to remember that as a writer. That's really helped me to try to turn all that off and realize that at the end of the day, I have to be happy with what I've written, and the ideal reader is out there somewhere. That said, I think I have learned a lot about uh, how to structure a poetry manuscript from looking at different manuscripts and why they worked or didn't work for me. As I mentioned before, about having some kind of a thematic arc or movement or several movements that all progress throughout the book. There has to be that forward motion and that thematic consistency. Uh, and writing the novel as well, I think right now, actually working on a fantasy novel. It's a adult urban fantasy novel about near future America where queer magicians are fighting Christian nationalists. So it is a lot of fun and a lot of work and totally different and scary from what I've done before. And that's definitely been helpful to read a lot of North Street genre fiction, because it's really forcing me to remember to stay sort of consistent in my world building, and to not, just because it's a magic novel, not to just throw in randomly like, oh, he has this power and he has that power, but to really not use the fantasy aspect as a shortcut for internal logic. That things still have to have a price. There has to be any sort of energy expenditure, any sort of use of power has to have some kind of, you know, some kind of price behind it, or some kind of a logic and constraint on it, to make
Yeah.
it not feel random and to keep the tension high. And that's
Mhm.
something I've learned a lot through reading books that didn't do that as well, maybe were really
Mhm.
inventive, but just felt like one thing after another was just pulled out of a hat because they
Mhm,
needed
mhm.
someone to have a power to make something happen.
We had a very good post-apocalyptic fiction winner a couple of years ago, and I'm
Oh
trying
yeah,
to find it
endemic.
now. Yes, it was Endemic.
Yes, that was really good, and I don't
That
like
was really good.
post-apocalyptic fiction, so that really
Yeah.
sold me.
Really great premise, very timely premise given that
Mhm.
it was, during the pandemic that it came out, and really good focus on the premise and really explored a lot of the different kind of facets that this premise suggested.
I think that was an example of a book where, um, because the main character was different, she was
Yeah.
this kind of
Yeah.
crusty, asexual, kind of spectrumy, middle-aged book editor,
Yeah.
Gee,
Yeah.
relatable,
Yeah.
except for the asexual part. Yeah, relatable.
Yeah.
You know, so that's like not the kind of protagonist you usually get in these action, plague, ruins of New York kind of movies. So
Yeah.
uh, that's something that I really take as a guide of what made this book stand out from a genre that's so saturated with other entries. Was um, there was it was looking at this kind of very familiar scenario of like a post-plague apocalyptic New York through a really different character. That's a
Wonderful.
structural choice um,
Yeah.
that's worth considering. Also, how, if you've got a genre that's been done a lot, how can you put a different type of character? You will see really different facets of that scenario through a character that is not the typical protagonist.
I think we're kind of getting to the end here. Thank you so much for speaking with me. Are
Oh,
there
thank
any
you.
parting words of encouragement or advice that you have for the North Street entrance this year?
I think the one last thing I want to say, because we've talked about sensitivity readers and developmental readers, is that there's a lot of oversensitivity and weird kind of ideological policing and identity proof, asking for proofs of identity in the literary world, which I think can be really unhelpful. Uh, but I think sensitivity reads as a practice are great. And if you want to call it something else, because sensitivity sounds like a weird word to you, that's fine. But just consider it research. don't think of it as someone that has to give me permission to write outside my demographic, or why don't I have the right to write outside my demographic. Think of it as research. If you were going to write an action movie, you'd research guns and airplanes and history and whatever it is. You know, if you're going to write a medical thriller, you talk to a doctor about whether this is a plausible treatment for this illness and are these the right symptoms. So if you're going to write about a certain culture or demographic, you know, don't take it personally that you have to um, get permission from a group to write about a certain kind of character. Just think of it as you want your book to be realistic and believable. And if you care enough about, you know, say, you know, Black trans teenage girls to write a book that has one in it, then you want it to be a book that a Black trans teenage girl is going to pick up and say, hey, this person really cares about me and understands me. And if you don't care about people like that, then maybe you shouldn't write books about them, because then you're not really putting your heart into the book and you're not writing about what matters to you. So,
Thank you so much for
yeah.
saying that.
Well,
Oh
thank
my
you very
goodness.
much for all these great questions. And thank you, all people who are watching, for engaging with Winning Writers. We're really proud of you for having written a book, finished a book, designed a book, published a book, and had the guts to send it in to us. If we
Yes.
don't like it, somebody will. And doesn't matter. Just, you know, love yourself and write your books.
Yes, thank you so much. And also, there are a lot of books that we really, really like in the contest
Mhm.
that don't end up winning the contest because it's very, very
Mhm.
competitive.
Mhm.
So, just because we didn't give it the highest honor doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve any honors. And I'm really
Mhm.
hoping that this year, the guaranteed feedback can make that a little more clear to entrants who
Mhm.
landed very, very high at the top of their categories, but didn't quite make the final cut. There's a lot of
Mhm.
great work out there. So, once
Mhm.
again, thank you so much, Jendi. It was really wonderful to talk to you about this. And I just to say once again, Jendi's new novel origin story is going to be coming out on July 15th. I am so excited about it. And Jendi, hopefully we can be talking about this more as time goes by.
Delighted to. Thank you so much, Annie.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.